My name is Roger Wetherall, and I am the moderator for today's program. It's being brought to you by the International Association for Peace and Economic Development, which is one of the core associations of the Universal Peace Federation. So our mission in this association is to attract and develop innovative business, government, and economic thought leaders who can collectively work on impacting society through collaboration, education, personal development, and deepen relationships that help to lead the creation of a global environment that's conducive to mutual prosperity between people and between nations in the world. So our topic for today is focused on Korea and how we can work with Korea to perhaps open it up and create more harmony in this area of the world. So North Korea is often described as an irrational or a mad place. But according to our presenter today, that's not true. They have a certain logic behind everything that they do. And its leaders have been great masters of survival. In fact, they've survived against the odds for more than 70 years. So in order to see why North Korean policy is logical, we have to keep in mind the decision maker's ultimate goal. And that has nothing to do with economic growth. It's all about surviving. So the main strategic goal of the late Kim Jong-il was simple. He wanted to die a natural death while still in power, and he succeeded in 2011. So the main strategic goal of Kim Jong-un, the current leader, is the same. He wants to live to a ripe old age and die a natural death and, take care of his family and so on. So first, we're going to hear from Professor Andrei Lankov. He's going to present about this topic, and then we will have commentary from both Bradley Babson and Gerard Willis, who will offer their comments. So Andrei Lankov is has a very interesting past. He started off in Leningrad studying, which is now Petersburg, where he completed his undergraduate and graduate studies at Leningrad State University. And then he taught Korean history at the Australian National University. And since 2004, he has been teaching at Kookmin University in Korea at the College of Social Studies. He also serves as the director of Korea Risk Group, a consulting agency, and also, I believe, the parent organization for NK News, if people are familiar with that. His major research interest is, of course, North Korean history and society. And he has published numerous books on Korea, and I'll put a link into the chat in a little while if you want to go to Amazon and buy some of his books, but there's about half a dozen at least on the Amazon link. And he's contributed also to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Financial Times, Newsweek, and published a number of academic articles, including articles in foreign affairs and foreign policy. In 2017, the Foreign Policy magazine included him into the list of global thinkers. So Professor Lankov, if you would like to share your presentation now, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, so let's start. First of all, thank you for inviting me. And I will try to tell something which is probably not going to sound very optimistic. Because basically, first of all, I would repeat again that indeed, as Rogers has just said, North Koreans are not mad. They know what they are doing, and they know why they are doing it. Because their major goal is survival, not economic growth. They don't mind economic growth. They don't mind many other things. The North Korean leaders don't want their common people to starve. But above all, they don't want to be overthrown. And if it's necessary to starve people to stay in power, well, common people from their point of view have tough luck. So actually, what's happening? When Kim Jong-un took power in 2012-2018, he introduced reforms which were very similar with the reforms Deng Xiaoping introduced in China back in the 1980s. In many cases, they deliberately emulated China. Market economy, which by that time had existed and quite developed, was encouraged. Team responsibility was tried in the agriculture, and independence of all kinds of enterprises increased. And for a while, it worked. Not as well as in China, because it's very partial, very careful, but it worked. The reforms of 2012-2018 generated economic growth. We don't know exactly, because North Korea ceased to publish any statistics, any statistical data on economics 60 years ago. They don't publish. It's illegal to publish it. All economic statistics, according to their law, is secret. Nonetheless, there are some ways. So estimates vary. The growth was probably between 4 and 7%. Depends whom you believe. I've basically been there in 2016, 2018, and I was much impressed. What's important, it was not only in Pyongyang, but there was one big difference with China. When we talk about China, we talk about reforms and openness. In North Korea, we had reforms, but no openness, no political liberalization, no opening of the country. And there were very serious reasons why they did it. Because if you look at North Korean state, as it existed since the 1960s, it was really an embodiment of Orwellian nightmare, something straight from the novel 1984. A hyper-Stalinist society, maybe more Stalinist, actually Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader, he was more a Stalinist than Joseph Stalin himself. Just few features. I can go for hours, but just few features. All foreign publications of non-technical nature were essentially classified. They had to be kept in the special departments of the libraries. And in theory, it was not always implemented, but in theory, you would not be allowed to have any foreign publication at home. No exception for the complications of the communist bloc. No radios with free tuning. Complete isolation. And if you basically, unless you had authorization, you were not supposed to talk to the foreigners. Well, a few minutes would do. Otherwise, a secret police would ask few questions. Why you were talking with this foreigner? And there was a reason. It was, people say it was paranoid. No, it was not paranoid. It was not more paranoid than somebody's reluctance to jump from the 10th floor. It's not paranoid if you don't want to do it. You just know what's happened to you, what happens to you. Major problem of North Korea was a massive and growing gap in per capita income, in economic performance between North Korea and its neighbors, above all South Korea. In North Korea, according to the North Korean own data, per capita GDP is roughly $1,300. In South Korea, it's $33,000. Gap 1 to 25. The largest gap which exists between two countries which share a land border. In Germany, gap between East and West Germany was something like 1 to 2 or 1 to 3. Here is 1 to 25. Why it's important? Because if we look at the North Korean ruling elite, and it's not Kim family, it's everybody who is somebody, a junior officer in the secret police, or just criminal police, or a teacher of some, Kim Il-sung biography, whose job is to tell students about the greatness of the Kim family. All these people. Well, these family members, maybe 500,000. They understand that for them to enjoy their modest privileges, they are not really rich. They are just by our standards, they're even poor, most of them, but still privileged life. They should keep common people ignorant about the outside world. Because if the common people learn how much they are lagging behind the South, they are likely to become restive. And if they become restive, regime collapse is possible. And if unification happens, this top, say, 5% or 2% are going to be in trouble. They're likely to be held responsible. And at best, they will be unable to keep their power because it's a divided country. Some people say China did it. Why not North Korea? Well, because South China does not exist. There is no a different state called South China, which lives 25 times better than North China. North Korea is a divided country. For Chinese are aware about American prosperity, but it's a prosperity of a different nation. It's not the reason to dislike Chinese government. There are rich and poor countries in the world. In South Korea, North Korea, it will be different. If North Koreans learn how South Korea, part of the same country, how rich they are. And historically, South Korea was a poor part of the country. North Korea used to be rich until 1945. If they learn it, of course, they will see it as a result correctly of mistakes committed by their ruling family. So, and they are going to be outraged. And unification of the country is likely to happen on conditions which are completely unacceptable for the North Korean ruling elite. So, North Korea can afford economic reforms, but it cannot afford political openness. Kim family does not emulate Chinese openness, not because they are paranoid, but because they are not paranoid, because they are not suicidal. In the under Kim Jong-un, between 1994 and 2011, we had partial disintegration of control. And what Kim Jong-un did when he took power, while in his economic policy was largely about relaxation, his policy in politics, access to foreign information, everything was overwhelmingly about increase in the level of control. For example, one of the first things he did, he began to invest big money into strengthening the border. They built fences on the border, which used to be, border with China used to be quite open. A lot of people moved there illegally, but most of them were not caught. Now it's increasingly difficult. Domestically, they are now waging a campaign against foreign video, massive campaign on the scale we have never seen it, to make sure that people would stop watching smuggled foreign videos, which are the major type of entertainment in the country. So isolation, it has been strengthened even when the economic reforms were implemented. However, economic reforms were suddenly stopped in 2018. Why? Few reasons. First, a crisis in relations with the United States. You remember the times when people were talking that, Korean Peninsula is on the brink of the war. Crisis was quite serious. Then we had COVID pandemics, but above all, changes in position of China. Sino-American rivalry was a gift for North Korea. They are very happy to learn about worsening relations between Washington and Beijing. This is exactly what they want. Why? Relations between China and North Korea have never been good. It's usually said that China is an ally of North Korea. No. Yes, when it was necessary in 1950, China saved North Korean regime from being crushed by the UN forces, essentially Americans with some assistance of South Koreans. China saved North Korean regime, but attitude was always extremely uneasy. Say in North Korea, they very often cheated Chinese in a very kind of Chinese businesses, abused Chinese, and many North Korean officials got in trouble because they were too close to China. China was unhappy about North Korean nuclear project because it undermines Chinese unique position as one of the very few official nuclear states. But for China, North Korea is a vital, is a very important vital buffer zone. However, so attitude was very ambivalent. But when the conflict with the United States began, all this ambivalence has to be basically thrown to the window. Because now, for the Chinese, status quo maintenance in Korea is vital. China needs status quo. China needs buffer zone. China is willing to overlook problems which used to be irritating. Value of North Korea, strategic value, increased dramatically. So China has always wanted Korea to be stable and divided, both stable and divided. But now it wants it much more. So it means that China is willing to support North Korea to keep it afloat. Three major items North Korea needs from China. At least two of them, they are getting insufficient quantities, which are three major items, 3F if you like: food, fuel, and fertilizer. And if we look at the satellite imagery, if we look at the domestic price dynamics, there is no doubt that North Korea is getting abundant supply of fuel, which is, by the way, legal because there are very strict limits of how much you have to sell to North Korea. Chinese are sending to North Korea much more, and obviously free of charge or at very low prices. Fuel and food, because food prices are relatively stable. Yes, we have food problems, but we should not overestimate these problems. And with fertilizer, it's a bit more complicated. But it looks like that they are getting something as well. So China is providing them with free of charge with food, fuel, and fertilizer in order to solve China's major strategic goal. That is buffer zone. They need a stable North Korea. They don't want unification of North Korea under South Korean control, and giving the relative size of two Korean states' economies, population, and everything, unification basically will mean absorption of North Korea by the South. And it's not what they want, Chinese. And they don't want a crisis. So they're willing to pay. And after all, if you take into account the massive giant size of the Chinese budget, it's not going to be very expensive. So probably they are going to pay to make sure that country will remain stable. China does not want economic growth. China just wants to make sure that common people is not starving, or at least say even modestly, that not too many North Korean commoners are starving, while the elite decision makers will have some basic, few slices of meat every second day, their modest luxury. And to make sure that surveillance system will work. If regime collapses, China is highly likely to undertake a military intervention now. But they would not like to do it. They would prefer to keep it afloat by modest shipments of 3F, food, fuel, and fertilizer. And these shipments are not going to be a big burden for China. So, for North Korean leaders, there are very good reasons to be happy about what's going on. And they reacted to this situation, to this Chinese aid, in a very simple way. They stopped reforms. Why? Because reforms, even without reforms, without openness, are a bit dangerous. Because they create political forces, people who are less dependent on the state. They create markets. The 2012-2018 reforms, like Chinese reforms of the 1980s, were creating people who were independent of the state, difficult to control, hence potentially dangerous. They did it because they wanted economic growth. Without economic growth, they would not get stability. But now, stability, maybe without much growth, but still stability, is provided to them by China. Why should they take risks? So Kim Jong-un made a rational decision. For the time being, at least, there are some reasons to hope that he will probably go back to reforms eventually, but for the time being, he stopped market reforms. He stopped all his experiments with controlled marketization and is trying to go back to the central control. And it's irrational for the time being, because let's remember, his major goal is not prosperity of his people, even though he would not mind. His major goal is his political and maybe physical survival, because if he is overthrown, even his physical survival will be under great threat. So his major goal is to stay alive. And if it means that his people are going to eat less, well, tough luck to the people. Yes, on this point, I'm probably stopping my short review of what's going in North Korea over the last 10 years and why. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lankov. It's a very thought-provoking presentation, although I have to say it doesn't give me a lot of hope that things are going to change very much. But I'd like to hear a little bit from our respondents here today. And so I'd like to introduce our first respondent, Bradley Babson. And since 1997, Bradley Babson has studied the North Korean economy and written extensively on economic perspectives on the integration of North Korea into the international community. He's a former chair of the DPRK Economic Forum at the U.S. Korea Institute, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and recently he served on the World Economic Forum's Global Futures Council on the Korean Peninsula. So he presently serves on the Advisory Council of the Korean Economic Institute of America and the Advisory Committee on the National Committee for North Korea. He worked for the World Bank for 26 years before retiring in 2000. He worked mainly in East and Southeast Asia, including serving as the regional representative in Bangkok, and he opened the World Bank office in Hanoi in 1994, which we had a program where he talked previously about the parallels between Vietnam and Korea, and I hope you can offer us some insight today about this situation. Bradley, over to you.
Well, thank you. And Andrei, I appreciate very much your presentation. I've always appreciated your perspectives, and I think you've given us a lot to think about the current situation facing North Korea, which is pretty dire from my perspective. And I agree with much of the logic of Andrei's assessment that Kim Jong-un since 2016-17 has just faced enormous challenges due in part to external factors and in part to his own strategic choices that North Korea is not going to give up their WMD deterrence capabilities that have evolved very rapidly despite sanctions in the recent years. And we face a very different North Korea today than we did back in the 1990s when the agreed framework was negotiated and North Korea was facing a famine, a much worse economic situation than it is now. But I think, the question from the U.S. perspective has always been, can the North Korean leaders, can the Kim leaders, can they have their cake and eat it too? That's the challenge I think we're all trying to grapple with right now. Is North Korea in a situation that they can manage and survive no matter what the price for their people, and continue to maintain the strategic leadership of the country in the ways that they feel are at least important from their point of view, or are they really going to have to make compromises and adjust their approach in their relations with both with their own people and with the international community in order to have a regime that is able to have both international and domestic support? And I think that's a real challenging question. And I'm not sure that the answer is yes, that they can have their cake and eat it too, no matter whatever happens in North Korea. I just want to say a couple words about the economic breakdown and the famine in the 90s, which led to really a major challenge for Kim Jong-il, particularly. It was triggered by bad weather and the trade shock induced by the collapse of the Soviet Union. And China's initial response back then, when the Soviet Union was not a kind of competitor for relations with North Korea, China's initial response was to increase friendship prices, not reduce them, which didn't help the North Koreans in dealing with their
Sorry, Bradley, could I just interrupt you? There's a lot of background noise. I don't know if you have some papers or something that are hitting the microphone.
Okay. I just think that that the situation in the 1990s was dire, much more dire. I agree with Andrei than it is today. They've improved their capacity to produce food and much more efficient production capabilities under the reforms that took place over the last 20 years and the significant improvements in domestic productivity and the role of markets and all of that. I just wanted to say that one of the responses back in the 1990s was Kim Jong-il's willingness to open up to the foreign community for help and support and not to close it down, which is very different from the situation that we're facing now. He normalized relations with most of Europe and Canada and Australia, et cetera, not the United States or Japan, but with many other countries during that period. And there was an open doormat to NGOs and the UN to provide humanitarian assistance and allowing them into the country to have offices there, even though he was trying to protect the North Korean people from foreign influences. They really were exposed dramatically to new foreign influences during that period. And they even invited the IMF and World Bank to come for visit. And I led the first World Bank and only World Bank mission to North Korea in 1998. And they were very open about their economic problems and ways that they could get help to find their way out of the woods from a very difficult place they were in the late 1980s and 90s. And then Kim Jong-il revised the constitution to allow state enterprises to make profits. He legalized markets in 2003. So there was a lot going on in that period that kind of came to a screeching halt when the agreed framework was collapsed in about 2000, later in 2000, what was it, 3 or 4. And it was just a tragedy. And when North Korea went down the road of expanding nuclear tests and missile launches, he retreated back into what Andrei, I think, is correctly described as a kind of controlled marketization within their own borders and within their own thinking, without reaching out very heavily to outsiders for very much in the way of advice and support on the economic side. And it was a very complicated period, but it one that led them to the point where I think there's a whole generation of North Koreans now that have grown up with the experience and expectations that markets were a part of their life, that they were the way that the family survived, that the ratio of the economy that's in the market as opposed to the state managed part is at least a third of the economy, as you can argue about, but it's much larger than it was back in those days. And the social contract had changed. And I think that's, to me, one of the big questions. How much has the social contract really changed inside North Korea with the expectation that people can have their freedom to go and make money in various ways? And the entrepreneurs like the Donju can provide some real economic leadership in entrepreneurship and both in domestic and in their foreign business activities. It's just not the same country that it was back in the 90s, that country in the state of it today. And I just worry a lot that the current policy that Kim Jong-un is pursuing of trying to reestablish this sort of state control over the economy and over a lot of the private freedoms that people have grown to expect, that they can actually hold on to that very long. I think it's a very difficult situation for them to maintain. I also think that, you know, when Kim Jong-un took power, his first New Year's speech, promised the North Korean people that they'd never have to tighten their belts again. And he's put an awful lot of effort and his own priorities on elevating economic development, at least equal to the level of their national security weapons programs, in order to provide a better foundation for the society to make their way in a partnership with the government in improving the lives of ordinary North Koreans, and with, I think, considerable success, as Andrei has pointed out in this period, despite all of the turbulence of the international relationships that North Korea has had because of its weapons programs over the years. But I think, you know, because of the impact of COVID on top of the sanctions that were imposed, not just on the military economy, but also on the general economy back in 2017 and 18. The combination of those three things has achieved what the U.S. has hoped to accomplish in finding a way to apply maximum pressure to force Kim Jong-un to capitulate to what the U.S. and presumably the UN Security Council wanted in terms of national defense policy, and being able to get into a different relationship on that side of things, that he could pressure him into making a strategic choice to go a different route. And it took COVID to sort of bring that to reality. The sanctions alone did not achieve that, and I agree with Andrei. Kim Jong-un was willing to put up with a lot of pain for his people because of the sanctions, in order to sustain the level of his military ambitions. But the COVID situation and the way that he responded by prioritizing public health over the income needs of the people have brought them to, I think, as close to maximum pressure as it's possible to get. And now that maybe the tide is turning a little bit as they begin to contemplate opening up the border with China some more and beginning to put some relief back into the system. The question is, where does this leave us in terms of how we think about the way North Korea manages the challenges that it still faces on food security and public health, and the expectations of the North Korean people that were generated over these years of meeting their own needs through market activity, not just relying on the state to provide them public distribution support, which is pretty much dissipated for big segments of the population by now anyway. I'm a little skeptical that China will provide all of the support that North Korea needs to make it Kim Jong-un feel that he can manage the current situation. I think some of the recent publications that I've read about the energy situation in North Korea, it hasn't really changed much, a lot, since for a long time. And the energy economy is really critical to a sustained economic development effort. And this recent agricultural meeting that he had with the Central Committee really came up with nothing new. It was not very convincing that he's going to mobilize a lot of effort to really improve the domestic food production. And we know how important that is. And I've just been reading yesterday that he's put the military on that course to focus on agriculture rather than on their military duties in order to help to address this food security issue. So I'm just skeptical that he can have his cake and eat it too now, and it gives me a lot of concern about where we go from here, and whether, particularly with the escalation of military tensions between North Korea and the U.S. and South Korea and Japan right now, what the likely story is for lowering the temperature and getting down to a more practical, realistic way of giving Kim Jong-un what he wants, which is a job security and a country that can survive with its own people feeling that they can support their government and lead a decent life. And we can talk about more of that in the conversation.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, there's some good points there, and I'm interested also to hear a little bit about how you feel about what does North Korea currently think about the possibilities of unification with the South, and what your perspective would be on that, because it seems like China doesn't really want it, South Korea is not really interested in it, but what does North Korea think? Because they give a lot of lip service to it. But let's come back to that question after our next presenter. Okay, so I'd like to give Gerard Willis a chance to speak first. So Gerard Willis is the current president and CEO of HJ Magnolia US Holdings, which is a company that includes several businesses, including the New Yorker Hotel, the Manhattan Center, and the Washington Times, and US Marine. From 2020 to 2022, he was chairman of the HJ Magnolia Korea Foundation, which is the holding company for many industries, and is a conglomerate which is popularly known as a chaebol in Korea. So he was the first foreigner ever appointed to be in charge of such a conglomerate. And he's been based in Asia from 1988 until 2022, where he was originally, he was the general counsel and transactional attorney and business leader for Fortune 100 companies, a Wall Street law firm, a private direct investment fund. And then from 2003 to 2018, he was vice president and general counsel in Asia Pacific for Honeywell International. And he has a lot of practical business and legal experience and has lived in that part of the world for many years. So we wanted to get your perspective on this problem or this issue. Gerard, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, first, I couldn't agree more with Dr. Lankov's on the sources of Korean behavior. It may be shocking to our conscience, but it's really the only common sense explanation. And for some reason, I think Dr. Lankov is one of the first and few people I've heard to be so honest and straightforward about the motivation of the Kim regime, being willing to sacrifice the well-being of the Korean people to preserve their security, and willing to grasp at any expedient, in this case, including China's cold embrace, in order to protect what it perceives against what it perceives as an existential threat. A question is still, however, that I think needs more explanation, is whether and under what circumstances Kim would be willing to entertain or resume policies that, while potentially a threat to the regime, might contribute to the betterment of its nation and people. For example, Gorbachev, Glasnost, and Perestroika being a cautionary example, or a Deng Xiaoping Southern tour to promote getting rich being a more successful one. I should say, as Roger introduced, that my perspective on North Korea is not shaped by expertise in nuclear weapons, international security policy, or even macroeconomics, but rather my views are based on the efficacy of foreign direct investment to contribute to economic development and peace. And from that perspective, I have kept a practical watch on North Korean policy for the last several years. The business groups that I led in Korea from 2020 to 2022 was and still is, like other Korean chaebols, interested in investing in North Korea if sanctions are lifted. For example, our group's Yongpyong Resort, which was the alpine venue for the Seoul Winter Olympics in 2018, which some of you may remember was attended by Kim Jong-un's sister. Pyeonghwa Motors, an affiliated company of our group's founder, built a $55 million car manufacturing plant in North Korea, which the North Koreans are still operating today. Pyeonghwa Motors means peace motors in English. And our group's construction company was recently chosen to build the final spur of a railroad track that runs up Korea's east coast to the demilitarized zone and may directly connect with North Korea counterparts someday. So I will just raise this question. What does North Korea's policy, described by Dr. Lankov as, quote, a policy of reforms without openness, unquote, and its subsequent reversal add to our understanding of Kim Jong-un's goals and the constraints under which Kim Jong-un operates? Based on North Korean literature, as well as North Korean economic practices adopted during the period from 2012 to 2018, I believe that the period of what Dr. Lankov describes as reforms without openness was a sincere effort on the part of Kim Jong-un to develop North Korea's economy. Not only did Kim liberalize access to the previously established well-known economic development zones, such as the Kaesong Industrial Zone, which was the main focus of South Korean investment, but Kim also advocated creating such zones in every province to service local economies. At that time, he did not seem greatly concerned with the risks of ideological contagion or the threat it might pose to the regime. To the extent there was a national debate about the zones, it focused on practical issues such as currency, land use, HR, and even international financing. But by 2016, warning signs were emerging, and as Dr. Lankov has advanced, several hypotheses to account for the shift in Kim's attitude toward reforms, including one, South Korea's exit from Kaesong in 2016, citing North Korea missile launches, and the 2017 UN-imposed sanctions soured the regime on the long-term viability of the zones, and or two, the argument that such reforms threaten security of the regime finally got the upper hand. But these lead to the further question, which is, who pulled the rug out from under the economic policies of reform? South Korea and UN sanctions, or Kim Jong-un, due primarily to security concerns, that is, self-preservation concerns? Or if a bit of both, in what proportion? The answer to this question is unlikely to affect Western policies toward North Korea, while the nuclear question remains outstanding. But the answer may tell us something about the prospects for peace while Kim Jong-un is at the helm. Thank you.
Thank you. That was some good points brought up there. I was going to ask actually about the whole economic cooperation and the interrelationship that had gone on in the past. Why don't we get everybody back on the screen here now and we can have some discussion. We have a few questions in here, but there was kind of a question there that Gerard raised at the end, and I think that was directed more at Andrei. We were asking about these economic reforms, and do you see any potential for a resumption of economic cooperation between North and South Korea, or between North Korea and other areas like these economic zones of the past?
Big problem. I don't see why. Big problem is unrelated to North Korea. It's the UN Security Council sanctions. Because in 2016-17, sanctions were made really tough. If you have a look at the documents, I did have a look at the documents, it's terrifying. You cannot sell anything to North Korea. You cannot do anything in North Korea for economic benefits. Yes, humanitarian aid is possible, legal, but nothing else. A good story example is how in 2018, when China still took sanctions enforcement seriously, they stopped few 10,000, 70,000, if I remember correctly, first aid kits by the Chinese customs. They were stopped because every single kit has scissors made of the stainless steel, and you cannot send anything made of stainless steel to North Korea. So we have a situation of, catch-22. North Koreans you cannot invest in North Korea because virtually any conceivable type of investment is a violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. Nobody wants it by the Russians and Chinese. And they are doing it for strategic considerations. So South Korea will never dare to violate it. And it's basically a correct position, which means that in order to have this any kind of exchanges happening, you have to have sanctions removed. But sanctions will not be removed unless North Korea is going to surrender nuclear weapons. Or at least do something serious about serious downgrading of their nuclear potential. And North Koreans is the last thing North Koreans are going to do. Kim Jong-un probably would starve to death if necessary, 500,000 people, but he would keep his nuclear weapons in good order because he believes that without nuclear weapons, he will go away of Libya under Gaddafi, Iraq under Saddam, and fresh and very good example, Ukraine under whoever. So he will not surrender it. So he will keep nuclear weapons. UN Security Council will keep sanctions and no serious investment. I mentioned in passing that Russians and Chinese and Russians are willing to violate sanctions, but within limits too, by the way. They will not do too much. I can easily see how they will secretly sell extra fuel, but I cannot see them, say, investing money into big mines or railway construction in North Korea. So even for these countries, it's an obstacle, and I don't see how it can be removed, because basic conditions are unacceptable for North Korea. Do something about nuclear weapons, and without these conditions being met, the other key player, United States, will not move a finger.
Bradley, do you want to give some comment about that too?
Well, I agree with Andrei that they've been put in a position that is very difficult for Kim Jong-un, because it's not only just trade, it's also access to foreign exchange. Even if you're an embassy or an NGO and you happen to have an office there, you can't bring money in. It's become a very compromised way to have any kind of relationships, humanitarian or business relationships with North Korea, that could be acceptable both for the North Korean side and under UN Security Council sanctions. So the question is there a roadmap? Is there an off-ramp here? Because this escalation of confrontation that we're seeing right now could easily go awry. And for one reason or another, something could happen, and it would be very bad for Northeast Asia if miscalculations and mistakes lead to something that would be, I think, unacceptable from any kind of humanitarian perspective for either country. So
it's interesting. Sorry, you mentioned before about the sanctions, right? I just wanted to get a general poll here before we go on. Does anybody here think that the sanctions are actually having a positive effect on the relationship?
Well, I think my argument is it's not in the U.S. interest to have a sanctions policy that is not achieving its objective of curtailing the expansion of the WMD capabilities, but having an impact on the economy, on the humanitarian and human rights situation. And is that something that we're not getting anything good, but we're getting a lot of bad in the way these policies are being implemented right now? And is that the kind of reputation we want to hold on to, or should we find an off ramp to lower the threats, go down there was a project supported by the Asia Pacific Leadership Network last year, looking at the application of cooperative threat reduction principles to the Korean situation, which is not the same as it was in Ukraine and in Russia, obviously, for the reasons that Andrei's mentioned. But there are principles to lower the threats, to get more of a cooperative relationship, even if the objective in the near term is arms control rather than denuclearization, to lower the temperature, get things under control, build a relationship where you can work together on things, and build in a component that would deal with the rational economic and humanitarian needs of the country by relaxing sanctions and providing some kinds of foreign involvement and investment, as we were hearing earlier, that would sort of balance a managed security reduction process with an opportunity to build up a human security environment and health and food and other things that would benefit the North Korean people, and where you could get both domestic and international support for a set of relationships that can maintain peace and build up some stability in the region. And I don't think Korean unification is part of that, but I think cooperation among the countries is feasible if people can find a framework to work together and not at odds with each other.
So you'd advocate more of a relaxation in the sanctions in order to have, say, a progressive opening of the society. Gerard, what do you think about this idea?
Well, I start with China. And again, there are a lot of people thinking about nuclear threats and capabilities, know a lot more about this than I do. But it would strike me is that even from a China point of view, they can't be that thrilled with acquisition and threats by the North Korea involving nuclear weapons. First, even a nuclear exchange involving just the South Korean peninsula would affect China. Secondly, they can never be sure that such an exchange wouldn't trigger a larger war, which puts China itself at risk. So, in a sense, we're both at extreme positions now, both the West and North Korea, which either means people aren't able to negotiate, or perhaps gives them a lot of room to negotiate. So, I would advocate for a rethink of our position. What is it that we can accept, short of full and verifiable nuclear disarmament, if there's anything, and then what would we be willing to give up? I note that South Korea is, if you remember, they pulled out of Kaesong because they believed there was a belief that the funds being generated at the economic zone were being used in support of the North Korean nuclear weapon program. Now, I haven't gone into this in detail, so I'm not saying I believe it fully, but there was a 2017 study which concluded that was not the case. And in fact, if you poll South Koreans, half of them thought it was a mistake to pull out and believe that it was probably best in terms of the long-term future of the peninsula for investment to be part of the reconciliation process. So I think there's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot of distance to be covered, but I would just look for some trigger to start that process again, because I think there's things that both sides want and need and ought to be willing to talk about.
Good. So I'd like to change tack a little bit here. We have a couple of questions here about Japan China, right? So from Sebastian, he's asking, how much do you perceive Japan's current leadership being aware of its need to counterbalance Xi's Communist Party beyond just for the sake of strategic self-preservation? So is Xi using North Korea to kind of balance what's happening in Japan? And then the other one, it seems China is not in favor of Korean unification. Could the presenters comment on whether Japan wants an even stronger economic power next door and whether the US supports Korean unification? How about Swiss-style neutrality for the whole of Korea, as has been suggested by some scholars? Does anybody want to have a go at this? There's a lot of ideas there.
Just on the first question about the Japan relationship with South Korea and with China, we Americans don't often pay attention to this, but those three countries have worked very cooperatively together on their economic relationships. And I think I was reading just yesterday that China is calling for a re-emergence of this trilateral economic cooperation, how they work with each other on investment and trade within the region. And I've always felt that that's really an important framework to work with, because North Korea is sitting like a little donut hole in the middle of three huge economies, that if they're finding ways to work together like the EU does, there isn't any reason why, like the EU, they can't work with North Korea to bring them up to speed so that they could become a member of a regional economy group that was working within a common framework, where that common economic framework provides a lot of incentives for lowering the temperature on military things and paying attention to the benefits of regional cooperation from an economic point of view, the same way Europe has evolved. And we've never really explored very deeply how that kind of a process might be a game changer if it reassured North Korea that their sovereignty would be respected, their economy could be better integrated, and trading with Japan, China, and South Korea as a three-legged stool would be a much safer and longer-term stable place for North Korea's economy than the way it's functioning now. That's for sure.
Sure. Professor Lankov, do you have any thoughts about Japan's involvement in all of this?
Yeah, I think that basically Japan and China, by the way, well, first of all, if we have situation when unification becomes realistically possible, and right now I see only one scenario: regime collapse in North Korea, revolution, perhaps quite bloody, and China, by some reasons, deciding not to get involved. If it happens, China and Japan, or for that matter, Russia too, but it's far less significant, are not going to be happy about unification. Especially China is a major problem. So yes, I would say neutrality of Korea might be a solution. Question is the American government willing to withdraw American forces? And probably not. Number two, the majority of the Koreans now don't want American forces to be withdrawn. You know, last year was remarkable. In public opinion polls, China made a massive victory. They overtook Japan as the least popular country in South Korea. For a century, Japan was number one, and suddenly, bang, it's China. So South Korean government, which lead effectively a government of the unified Korea, because everything will be decided by the Southerners. If not everything, 90%, they are not going to be happy about it. And well, maybe still some compromises possible, not Switzerland style, but at least promises not to station US forces and military assets north of the current DMZ. It might be helpful, might slightly pacify China, But again, we are talking about very low probability scenario. 10 years ago, it was reasonably high probability, but the world has changed.
Okay. I'd like to come back to the question I asked at the end of Bradley's thing. How does North Korea think about the prospects of unification? And what would that look like? I mean, they've built this huge army. They're always posturing. They're sending drones across the border. They have these missiles. Are they really serious about the possibility of still attacking North Korea?
Yes.
South Korea?
Yes.
Yeah.
They are becoming serious again. I would change slightly adverbs. They are becoming serious again. Because it was a pilot, they obviously abandoned this dream of a military conquest at some point around 1990, because they had no means to take over the South, and they understood it. And for the first few decades, their nuclear program was essentially defensive in nature. It used to be defensive. Problem is, two things which are very worrisome. Have they care only about defense? They probably should stop in 2013, when they had mid-range ballistic missiles, capability to inflict unacceptable damage to any possible adversary, but they didn't stop. They are working very hard on two programs, which are both of definitely offensive nature. First of all, ICBM programs. They want to make sure that they will be able to attack American cities, any American city, and get through anti-missile defenses. And what is more worrisome, even more worrisome, because this one you still can justify saying, well, it's super double plus good deterrence. But what about tactical nuclear weapons? They are working on this. They're making a lot of noise of it. They are going to test their first nuclear weapon, tactical nukes, very soon. And it's quite clear why they need it. Tactical nuclear weapons can be used on the battlefield. And they're doing it to overcome massive superiority of the South Korean military in the conventional weapons. So they are basically working on weapons which will help them to defeat South Korean military, no matter how many fancy toys they have. These toys are no match to old, crude nuclear weapons. And in the same time, to blackmail Americans, to tell them, yes, you want to save Seoul, say goodbye to San Francisco.
It's a scary prospect.
Yes. And I think it's not what they really want to do right now.
Yes.
The situation is not ripe, but they want at least to have means to do it when and if the opportunity will avail itself.
So I want to give
if I
Gerard
may,
a chance. Yes.
if I may make a plug for our newspaper, the Washington Times, we have a new correspondent in East Asia, John Solomon, and he's done a series of articles on even the conventional balance between North and South Korea, and it's a little scary. The North Koreans are developing, very strong capabilities, even vis-a-vis a conventional assault on South Korea. And if I may add one other point as to the last question, I don't think the Switzerland paradigm works in East Asia. First is historically, for historic reasons. I mean, the Korea has always been a country of competition between China, Russia, Japan, three very large countries with strong interests in dominating Korea. And then Koreans too, even themselves, have a history of picking one side or the other for thousands of years. Were the younger brother of China. I don't think there's a tradition or again, unless America remains involved as the balancing power, a possibility of it staying independent as a Switzerland.
And Bradley, we're at time here, so I want to give you just a few minutes to kind of wrap up, and then we'll come back to Professor Lankov for some closing remarks. So, Bradley?
Well, I would just like to highlight the fact that demography counts in Asia. All of those countries are facing very major demographic challenges that are going to affect their politics and their economy and their economies, and create new incentives for working together in ways that they haven't been willing to. Just look at the immigration policy in Japan right now. I mean, it's these sort of deep change, deep dynamics are going to be very influential in Asia. And I think sooner or later, people realize, like in COVID, we're putting a lot of money into military, but the real threat isn't coming from military. It's coming from other places, like the diseases, but also demographics is going to be a major driver of change, not only in Asia, but in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I've seen some reports looking at South Korea's demographics that the population would be almost halved by the end of the century. So that's quite a substantial change. And Japan, I think, and China also the same situation. So it'll be interesting. And Andrei, would you like to make some closing comments, and then we'll wrap up?
I would like to say that over the last few years, the world has changed to the worse. It's not the end of the world, it's not a disaster, but many assumptions I have lived my life for decades with are not relevant anymore. And in regard to North Korea, to Korean situation, I think we are, I would say, at the beginning of a long, dark tunnel. Sorry, my English, funny accent, I know, sometimes make funny mistakes. Basically, it's a bit like, train gets into this long, dark space. We are not going to be able to maneuver, nobody, because everybody is everybody's prisoners. Is a situation such a web of obligations, concerns, real and perceived threats, which makes almost impossible to get away from this track. And I have no idea where we are going right now, but I see that not only we sitting here, but nobody else, including some people who live in the place known as the White House, will be able to do much about the situation. Everybody is a prisoner of the objective situation, which is unpleasant. And what worries me is the situation is, as I have mentioned, the military situation is deteriorating. We, first time, increasingly facing a real, but not actual, but strong potential threat from North Korea. The threat of conquest of the South is not a fantasy again, used to be fantasy for 3 decades. Nobody in his right mind would talk about it. And finally, something we did not mention, it's the line of the current government, Yoon Suk-yeol's government in North Korea, which I believe is basically, if it's the right expression, put oil to the fire. Because I understand their concerns, but they are not just hardliners, which makes sense, but they try to advertise their hardline as loudly as possible, and this is dangerous. It's a bit like these maneuvers. Yes, they should do joint maneuvers, but why they are so noisy about it? Because North Koreans see it as provocations, and frankly, they are right. Because we have seen some cases when some maneuvers have been done for years, for decades, like the special forces maneuvers. They were happening every year for 3 or 4 decades, but they were never made public. And the Yoon Suk-yeol government deliberately make as much noise as possible around any kind of military exercises, creating the situation when North Koreans will have to do something equally provocative. Dangerous game. But it's a side remark. What is most important, very little can be done. And well, time will change. But when will it happen? I know not. Maybe next year, maybe next decade, maybe to early 2040s. I don't know.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up at this point. I really wanted to thank our presenters and commentators here, especially Dr. Lankov, for you getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning in Korea to actually do this for us. You are more dedicated than me, I think. So,
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I really appreciate that. And also for Gerard and Bradley, you really brought some, different perspectives to the problem. And I think a very deep seriousness to it as well, that when we start to look at the what happened recently in Ukraine, we never really could have imagined that Russia would have invaded, a year ago. The same things can happen anywhere in the world. And Korea is still a flashpoint, still an area of the world that needs a lot of attention. So thank you very much, everybody. And we hope to talk to you all again very soon.